There is a place older than memory, before the first temple was raised, before the first prayer was spoken into cold morning air, before any human hand had drawn a god upon a cave wall. There was the earth. And the earth in those oldest of days was not silent. She breathed, she ached, she bled. Her name was Gaia. And from that blood, quite literally from it, something extraordinary came into the world. The story begins not with a battle, not with thunder, not with the clash of divine shields ringing across mountain peaks. It begins with a wound. When the Titan Kronos, acting on the quiet fury of his mother Gaia, took a great sickle and struck his father Ouranos, the sky, and the blood of that ancient god fell down upon the earth. The ground received it, the way a field receives rain, deeply, hungrily. And from that sacred, terrible union of divine blood and living earth, the giants were born, not crafted, not shaped, not breathed gently into being, born, erupting from the soil, fully armored, vast in stature, burning with a power that had no name yet, because nothing quite like it had ever existed before. The Greeks called them the Gigantes, and what they were precisely has always defied easy description. They were not gods, though they carried divine blood in their veins. They were not mortals. Nothing about them was frail or brief or small. They occupied that vast, unsettling space between, children of the earth and the heavens both, belonging entirely to neither, answerable to no order that had yet been written. This is what made them so dangerous. The gods of Olympus, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Apollo, and the rest, ruled from their mountain throne with a certain confidence. They had won their place through the Titanomachy, the war against the elder Titans, and the world had been parceled out between them like an inheritance. The sky, the sea, the underworld, the seasons, all accounted for, all governed. The cosmos, they believed, was settled. It was not settled, because deep beneath the surface of things, Gaia had never forgiven the imprisonment of her children, the Titans, who now languished in Tartarus at Zeus's command. A mother's grief is patient, and so she nurtured her giants, these children of blood and earth, with a singular purpose. When the moment came, they would rise. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. They would march on Olympus itself, and they would reclaim what had been taken. This conflict, this great cataclysmic uprising of the giants against the Olympian gods, is known as the Gigantomachy, and it is one of the most extraordinary stories the ancient world ever told. The giants themselves were not a single uniform force. Each one was individual in the truest sense. Massive, yes. Ancient sources describe them as towering figures, their lower halves sometimes entwined with serpentine coils in place of legs, rising from the earth as though they had never fully separated from it. But beyond their size, each carried specific power, specific fury, and specific purpose. There was Enceladus, perhaps the most famous of them all, a creature of such immense force that even in defeat, the gods could not fully destroy him. He was buried alive beneath the island of Sicily, and the ancients believed that when the earth shook and Etna erupted in fire, it was Enceladus beneath it, still breathing, still raging, still turning in his prison beneath the stone, a giant so powerful that the world itself became his cage. There was Porphyrion, their king, the greatest among them, who set his eyes upon Hera herself during the heat of the battle, whose ambition was so vast that Zeus was moved to strike him personally with a thunderbolt, a rare and telling honor in its terrible way. There was Alcyoneus, who could not be killed on the soil of his homeland, an immortal within his own territory, a being whose very geography was his armor, The hero Heracles had to physically drag him, across the border of his native land before he could be slain. And there was Typhon, though some traditions place him separately. A force so immense, so genuinely terrifying, that even the gods of Olympus fled, transformed themselves into animals and scattered. Only Zeus eventually turned back to face him. What the Gigantomachy tells us, what it has always told us, beneath its armor and fire and mythological spectacle, is something about the nature of order, about what happens when the foundations of a world revolt against the structure built upon them. The giants are not simply monsters, they are grievance given form. They are the old earth pushing back against the new sky. And in the telling of their story, something remarkable happens. We begin to wonder, very quietly, whether the gods were quite as righteous as they claim to be. That question will follow us through everything that comes next. We have time. There is no rushing what the earth kept buried for so long. So let us begin. There is something the ancient sources understood that we, in our modern urgency, sometimes forget. That before any great conflict announces itself with thunder and spectacle, there is a long, quiet gathering. A slow accumulation of pressure, the way a storm does not begin in the sky. It begins in the sea, hours before, in a warmth and a heaviness that animals feel long before any cloud appears on the horizon. The giants did not simply appear one morning and march on Olympus. They waited. They existed. They had a world of their own, a realm that was neither the bright heights of the divine nor the sunlit plains of the human, but something older, deeper, and in its own way, far more primal than either. To understand the Gigantomachy, truly understand it, rather than merely follow its sequence of battles, we must first understand the world that produced these beings, the landscape they inhabited, the power that moved through them like groundwater moves through stone, invisible, patient, and immense. Gaia herself was their realm, not a metaphor, not a symbol. The earth, the literal, physical, breathing earth, was both their mother and their domain. The giants were chthonic beings in the truest sense of that word, chethanos, of the earth, beneath the earth, belonging to the deep places, while the Olympians looked upward, built their thrones on mountain peaks, and wrapped themselves in cloud and starlight. The giants looked downward and inward. Their power rose from below, from the dark, mineral richness of the world beneath the soil, from the places where roots go when they go deep enough to find water, from the places that have never seen light. This is not to say they were creatures of shadow in the moral sense. The ancient Greeks were careful about that distinction, even when later interpreters were not. The giants were not evil in the way a villain is evil, calculating, malicious, choosing darkness for its own sake. They were elemental. They were force without refinement, enormity, without the careful architecture that the Olympians had learned to build around their own power. Where Zeus wielded his thunderbolt with intention, with political purpose, the giants moved the way earthquakes move, not with cruelty but with an absolute indifferent enormity that made human-scale notions of cruelty seem almost irrelevant. Their realm in the period before the war was understood to lie at the edges of the known world. The ancient Greeks imagined the world as bounded, a great disk, encircled by the river Oceanus, with civilized lands at the center, and progressively stranger, wilder, more potent territories as one moved toward the periphery. And it is to those peripheries that the giants belonged, to the places beyond the last mapped coast, to the volcanic islands where the ground itself was unstable, where fire came out of the earth without warning or explanation, where the boundary between what lay above the soil and what lay beneath it seemed negotiable, even fragile. Phlegra, sometimes called Pallene, a peninsula in Thrace, is one of the specific locations the ancient sources name as the gathering ground of the giants. It was a place understood to be scorched, volatile, geologically restless. A fitting home. The name itself carries the resonance of phlegene, to burn, and there is something deeply intentional in that geography. The Greeks located their most dangerous, most elemental forces at the places where the earth itself seemed to be struggling with something internal, where it could not quite contain what moved inside it. Volcanoes, in particular, were understood as evidence of giants, not merely symbols of them. Actual, physical evidence. When Etna erupted, it was Enceladus turning beneath it. When the ground shook in the islands of the Aegean, it was the breath of imprisoned giants pressing against the stone above them. The ancient world did not separate its geology from its mythology the way we do. The Earth's behavior was the story. The eruption was the giant. This was not poetic license. It was observational theology, an attempt to make coherent sense of forces that genuinely exceeded human understanding. And so, the realm of the giants was, in a very real sense, the Earth in its most ungoverned, most energetic, most dangerous expressions. The lava field, the fault line, the place where the ground opens without warning, the hot spring that scalds, the cave that goes down far enough that sound changes, and the air smells of minerals and deep time. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant for the ordinary people of the ancient world. These were not purely abstract forces to them. A person living near the slopes of Etna in the 5th century BCE did not have the vocabulary of tectonic plates and magma chambers. What they had was the deep, bone-level awareness that the ground beneath their feet was not reliably solid, that it could move, crack, erupt, swallow, and the story of the giants gave that terrifying reality a form that could be understood, spoken about, prayed against. The giant buried beneath the mountain was not a comforting thought, but it was a coherent one. It gave the eruption an author, and an author, however fearsome, is less terrifying than pure, authorless chaos. This is one of the quiet gifts of mythology that we lose when we treat it only as entertainment. Now, what of the giant's power itself in this period before the war began? The ancient sources are consistent on certain points and fascinating in their variation on others. Size is the most obvious attribute. The giants were understood to be of enormous stature, though the specific measurements varied wildly depending on the source and the period. Some traditions describe them as merely very large men, perhaps 2 or 3 times human height. Others describe beings so vast that a single footstep reshaped the landscape. The truth, as is so often the case with myth, probably lives in the tension between those two descriptions. They were large enough that scale itself was part of their power, but specific enough as individuals that each had a particular character, a particular fighting style, a particular vulnerability. And vulnerabilities they had. This is one of the most theologically interesting aspects of the giants as a class of being. They were, by most accounts, not immortal in the way the gods were immortal. They could be killed, but, and this is the crucial detail that shaped the entire gigantomachy, they could only be killed by a combination of god and mortal working together. Neither alone was sufficient. A god striking a giant could wound, could subdue, could drive back, but could not deliver the final, ending blow. Only when a mortal hero stood alongside the divine could the giant be fully destroyed. This single detail is extraordinary when you sit with it long enough. It suggests something profound about the Greeks' understanding of power and its limits. The gods, for all their magnificence, were not complete on their own when facing the truly ancient forces of the earth. They needed the human. The mortal, fragile, temporary human was a necessary ingredient in the defeat of the primordial. There is a theology buried in that mechanic, a suggestion that the relationship between gods and humans was not simply one of worship and reward. of supplication and occasional favor, but something more interdependent, more honest. The gods needed something from humanity that they could not manufacture themselves. What that something was, the myths do not state outright, but it lives in the stories. It lives in the fact that Heracles, half god, half mortal, the walking embodiment of that divine human combination, was summoned specifically because the prophecy demanded his presence. Without Heracles, the gods could not win. With him, the outcome, though hard and costly, was never truly in doubt. This is the world, then, in which the war was building. A world where the giants gathered at the burning edges of things, where the earth remembered its own grievance, where Gaia moved through geological time with a patience that made even divine lifespans seem brief. A world where the forces that had preceded the Olympian order had never entirely disappeared. They had only been pressed down, held under, given new names for new fears. The Olympians, seated in their mountain serenity, may have believed they had resolved the question of power once and for all when they defeated the Titans. Gaia knew otherwise. She had time. She always had time. The earth is never truly still, and it is never truly finished with what it has begun. It circles back, it resurfaces, it reminds the structures built upon it, however tall, however golden, however loudly worshipped, that they rest, ultimately, on ground that breathes. And when Gaia decided at last that the moment had come, the giants did not need to be summoned or commanded or convinced. They simply rose, as things born from the earth always, eventually, do. Every war has its personalities, and the Gigantomachy, for all its cosmic scale, for all its erupting earth and falling mountains and fire flung across the sky, was, at its heart, a war of individuals, of beings with specific names, specific hungers, specific ways of meeting the world and trying to break it open. The giants were not an army of identical enormities. They were a gathering of distinct, singular forces, each one a different expression of what the earth could produce when it was truly, deeply angry. To know the Gigantomachy is to know them by name. So let us take our time with them. Let us walk among them slowly, the way you would walk through a museum of very old, very large things, with attention, with a degree of reverence, and with the understanding that what we are looking at was, to the people who first told these stories, not ancient at all. It was simply true. We begin with Enceladus. If the Gigantomachy has a face, a single image that rises first when the mind reaches for this war, it is often his. Enceladus was understood to be among the most powerful of the giants, a being of such extraordinary force and such fierce, consuming rage that even his defeat could not be made final in the ordinary sense. The goddess Athena, in most tellings, was his primary opponent, and she was more than equal to him in battle. But the question of what to do with him afterward proved, in its own way, as difficult as the fighting itself. He was buried, pressed beneath the island of Sicily, with the volcanic mass of Mount Etna placed upon him as both prison and seal. And there he remains, in the ancient understanding, not dead, not gone, but contained, breathing through the mountain, his rage expressing itself in eruption and ash, and the slow, grinding movement of the earth above him. What is remarkable about Enceladus is not his power, exactly. Many giants were powerful. What is remarkable is the quality of his persistence. He could not be annihilated. He could only be managed, and there is something in that which the ancient Greeks clearly found both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The idea that certain forces are not resolvable, only suppressible. That beneath the orderly surface of things, something continues to burn that no divine authority has ever fully extinguished. Etna still erupts, of course. It erupted last century. It will erupt again. Make of that what you will. Then there is Porphyrion, king of the giants, the largest by most accounts and the most strategically formidable, which is to say, he was not merely enormous force, but enormous force with something approaching intention behind it. He led the assault on Olympus with a command authority that the other giants, wilder and more elemental in their fury, did not possess. He was the organizing principle of the uprising, insofar as such a thing could be organized. His target, during the heat of the battle, was Hera. He seized her, an act of such extraordinary audacity that it briefly, genuinely, threatened to destabilize the divine order in a way that mere physical combat could not, because there are different categories of threat. A giant throwing boulders is dangerous. A giant who reaches into the very center of the Olympian structure and grabs its queen is something else entirely. It is not merely an act of strength. It is a statement about power itself, about who holds it and on what terms. Zeus responded not with delegation but personally. A thunderbolt, cast by the king of the gods himself, struck Porphyrion down, and then Heracles finished what Zeus had begun. That sequence matters. The king of the gods and the greatest mortal hero, working in tandem, were required to defeat the king of the giants. The mathematics of that are worth sitting with. It suggests that Porphyrion was not simply large and dangerous. He was, within the logic of the myth, something close to an equal and opposite force to Zeus himself. A counter-sovereignty, a rival claim on the ordering of the world. Alcyoneus presents perhaps the most philosophically interesting case among all the giants. He was, by the terms of his own nature, unkillable within the boundaries of his homeland, the specific territory, his native land, the region where the earth knew him and claimed him as her own, rendered him effectively immortal. Wounds that would have ended any other being simply did not hold in that place. He absorbed them, recovered from them, rose from them as the ground rises after rain. There was no accumulation of damage that the soil he stood on would not quietly, relentlessly reverse. And so Heracles did what the straightforward application of force could never accomplish. He dragged him, physically hauled Alcyoneus across the border of his territory, out of the earth that recognized him, out of the ground that healed him. And only then, standing on foreign soil, did Alcyoneus become mortal in the way that could be ended. The mythological logic here is elegant and strange. The giant's power was inseparable from his place. He was not simply a being who happened to live somewhere. He was a being whose existence was constituted by a specific geography. To remove him from that geography was not merely to change his location, it was to change his nature. To unmake, in a quiet and almost gentle way, the specific conditions that made him what he was. There is a philosophy buried in that story about roots and belonging, and the particular kind of strength that comes from being deeply embedded in something, and also about the particular vulnerability that such embeddedness can create when the world shifts around you. Polybotes was pursued across the sea by Poseidon himself, a chase of enormous, churning energy that ended when the god of the sea broke off a piece of the island of Kos and hurled it, burying Polybotes beneath it in the waters. That fragment of island became what we now know as the island of Nisyros, a small volcanic island in the Dodecanese that sits above what the ancient world understood to be a buried, breathing, still dangerous giant. Nisyros is, in fact, volcanically active. Its caldera is one of the most visible and accessible in Europe. Visitors walk across it today on paths that cross fumaroles hissing sulfurous steam from the ground beneath their feet. The ancient earth and the mythological earth, in this case, have never entirely separated. Clytius fell to Hecate and her torches, a detail that tells us something important about the ancient understanding of which divine powers were adequate to which threats. Hecate was a liminal goddess, a being of thresholds and crossings, of the spaces between categories. That she was the one to defeat Clytius suggests he was understood as a similarly liminal force, difficult to categorize, difficult to approach through ordinary divine means, requiring a power that operated at the edges of things rather than at their centers. Mimas was struck down by Hephaestus, the smith god, the maker, the one Olympian who worked with fire and earth and the transformation of raw material into shaped form. There is a satisfying symmetry in that pairing. The giant born of the earth, destroyed by the god who understood better than any other how to work with what the earth contained, not by overpowering it, by knowing it. Ephialtes, enormous, double-eyed, furious, was struck by arrows from both Apollo and Heracles simultaneously, one arrow in each eye, from two different directions, the divine and the mortal meeting in his body at the same moment. A death that is almost a diagram of the prophecy that made it necessary. What do we notice when we look at these figures together? Each giant is defeated by a different combination, a different god, a different method, a different application of the fundamental rule that the mortal must be present, must contribute, for the divine alone to prevail. There is no single formula. There is no universal weapon or universal strategy. The gigantomachy is won not through the application of one overwhelming force, but through specific responses to specific natures. This is the mark of a mythology that was thinking carefully about what it was saying. The giants are not interchangeable obstacles. They are distinct problems, and the gods who defeat them are, in the act of doing so, revealed as something more than simply powerful. They're revealed as capable of understanding, of reading the nature of what they face, and responding to it with intelligence rather than merely with force, except that even that intelligence is incomplete without the human alongside them. And perhaps that is the deepest thing the story is saying, that intelligence and power and divine authority, however vast, however ancient, are still not quite enough on their own, that the world is complicated enough, old enough, layered enough, strange enough in its deep geology, that even the gods must reach down to the mortal level to find what they are missing. The giants, in this reading, are not simply enemies, they are teachers. Terrible, enormous, burning teachers, but teachers nonetheless. And the lesson they forced upon Olympus was one that no comfortable divine existence could have provided on its own. That the earth beneath you is not simply a floor. It remembers, it grieves, and given enough time and enough blood, it rises. There is a particular quality to the moment before a great storm breaks. The air changes, sound behaves differently, birds go quiet. The light, if there is light, takes on a color that has no precise name, something between green and gray and gold, something that the body recognizes as wrong before the mind has finished processing it. Everything in the natural world that knows how to read the sky goes still and waits. The gods of Olympus had been waiting for something like this. They simply had not known precisely when it would come, or how large it would be when it arrived. When Gaia finally released the giants, when she gave the signal that the long patience was done, that the time of gathering had ended and the time of war had begun. It did not begin quietly. It did not begin with diplomacy or declaration, or the measured exchange of grievances. The gigantomachy opened the way earthquakes open, without negotiation, without warning that the warning signs hadn't already provided. For those with the wisdom to read them, the giants came up out of the earth, and the world, in every meaningful sense, changed. The ancient sources describe the opening of the battle in terms that strain even the generous vocabulary of epic poetry. Mountains were uprooted, not climbed, not mined, not tunneled through, uprooted, lifted from the ground, the way a man might lift a stone from a riverbed and hurl it. But giants tore whole peaks from the earth and stacked them, pelion upon ossa, in the language of the Odyssey, attempting to construct a staircase to heaven itself, to physically climb to Olympus and bring the war to the gods on their own elevated ground. This detail is worth pausing on, because it is not merely dramatic imagery. It is a statement about intention. The giants were not defending territory. They were not fighting to hold ground or protect something that was theirs. They were ascending. They were reaching upward with everything they had, with their bare, enormous hands, with uprooted mountains, with the full geological fury of the earth pressing upward against the sky. They wanted Olympus, not as a symbol, as a place. They wanted to stand where the gods stood, breathe the air the gods breathed, and by standing there, remake the order of the world into something their mother could endure. The gods met them, and here is where the Gigantomachy reveals itself as something more than a straightforward account of divine victory. Because the early stages of the battle did not go cleanly for Olympus, the sources are not uniform in their portrayal of the opening exchange, but the consistent thread running through them is one of genuine, alarming difficulty. The giants were not routed. They were not easily contained. They pressed the assault with a force that the Olympian order, for all its lightning and sea command and divine authority, found genuinely threatening. Zeus fought from the sky, hurling thunderbolts downward into the mass of giants below. Poseidon shook the earth. A god of earthquakes battling beings born of earthquakes, a collision of the same primal force working against itself. Athena moved with the calculated, precise intelligence that was always her greatest weapon, identifying weaknesses, directing the broader shape of the battle, understanding it as a strategic problem as much as a physical one. Apollo loosed arrows from a distance with that cold, bright, unhurried accuracy that was his particular gift. Ares drove forward with pure, consuming aggression, not strategy, not calculation, simply the absolute commitment to forward motion and violence that was his nature. And still the giants did not break. They threw back. They matched the thunder with stone and fire of their own. Volcanic rock, the ancient sources suggest, torn from the island of Lemnos and hurled upward into the divine formations. They generated their own fire, their own devastation, their own answer to every divine offensive. Enceladus advanced on Athena with a force that required everything she possessed to meet and hold. Porphyrion pressed toward Hera with a determination that broke through the first lines of divine defense entirely. There was a moment, and the ancient sources allow for this moment, quietly, between the lines, when the outcome was not settled, when Olympus could have fallen. It was then that the prophecy became urgent. The oracle had spoken it clearly. The gods could not win without a mortal at their side. And there was only one mortal whose nature fit the requirement. Only one who carried enough divine blood to survive the proximity to such power, and enough human substance to provide what the divine alone could not. Heracles arrived, the son of Zeus and the mortal woman, Alcmene, half god, half human, entirely himself, entered the Gigantomachy not as a supporting figure, but as a necessary one. The prophecy had not overstated this. He was not a supplement to divine power. He was the ingredient without which divine power, in this specific conflict against these specific enemies, was incomplete. His contribution to the battle was immediate and decisive in a way that goes beyond the individual giants he defeated, though those defeats were significant in themselves. Alcyoneus he dragged from his homeland, as we have already discussed, hauling the unkillable giant across the boundary of his own territory until mortality reasserted itself, and Heracles could finish what geography had prevented. Porphyrion, the king, fell when Zeus's thunderbolt struck first and Heracles' arrow completed the kill. But what Heracles provided, more than individual victories, was a turning of the battle's momentum. There is something in warfare, mythological, historical, or otherwise, that operates beyond the arithmetic of individual engagements. Something about the direction of energy, about which side is pressing forward and which side is reacting. Before Heracles, the giants were advancing. After him they were not. The line held. And then, slowly, it began to push back. The battles that followed were extraordinary in their variety and their violence. Dionysus, the god of wine, of madness, of the dissolution of boundaries, fought in the Gigantomachy with a particular, unsettling ferocity that surprised even his fellow Olympians. He carried a thyrsus, his ceremonial staff topped with a pine cone, and with it he fought with the same abandon that characterized everything he did. The giants he faced were, the sources suggest, genuinely unprepared for the nature of his assault, because Dionysus fought the way intoxication moves, unpredictably, without the linear logic that military force usually follows. He was, in this sense, a perfect counter to the elemental, forward-driving power of the giants. You cannot brace against what you cannot predict. Hephaestus, as noted, brought fire, real fire, shaped and directed fire, the fire of the forge applied as a weapon. He drove his bellows cart into the battle and turned the giants' own volcanic element against them, with the precision that only a maker could manage. There is something almost ironic in it, the earth's fire, channeled through the hands of the god who spent his life learning to work with exactly that, bent back upon the beings who had been born from it. Hecate fought with torches at the threshold of things, where the battle blurred between one kind of reality and another. Artemis loosed her arrows with the same clean, emotionless accuracy as her twin Apollo. Even Hera fought fiercely, fought with a personal intensity sharpened by Porphyrion's assault upon her person, which she did not forget, and did not minimize in the telling afterward. The fates themselves entered the battle, it is said, wielding bronze clubs. When the fates fight in the physical world, it is a sign that something is being settled at a level deeper than the battle itself. That what is being decided is not merely who wins today, but what kind of world comes after. The giants fell, one by one, not all at once, not easily. Each required its specific resolution, its particular combination of divine power and mortal contribution, its specific answer to the specific nature that each giant embodied. The war had no single climactic moment, where everything was decided in one stroke. It was a long, grinding, costly resolution. The way geological processes are long and grinding, the way the earth itself resolves its tensions, not in an instant but over accumulated time and accumulated pressure. And when the last giant had fallen, or been buried, or been driven back into the ground that had produced him, when the volcanic fires quieted and the uprooted mountains were left where they had fallen, and the smoke began to clear from the plain of Phlegra, what remained was not simply a victory. It was a changed world. Olympus still stood, the gods still ruled, the sky was still theirs, and the sea, and the seasons, and the long management of human affairs. But something had shifted in the texture of that rule. Something had been tested that had not been tested before, and had held but only barely, and only with help, and only because a mortal had stood alongside the divine and provided the necessary peace. The gods returned to Olympus, and the earth grew quiet again, the way it always does after a great release of what it had been holding. But Gaia was still there. She is always still there. And the giants, most of them, buried, sealed, pressed under stone and sea and the weight of divine decree, were not gone. They were simply waiting, as they had always been, patient at waiting, as the earth itself is patient. When a great story ends, it does not end. It changes form. It moves from the spoken word into the painted vessel, from the painted vessel into the carved frieze, from the carved frieze into the philosophical argument, from the philosophical argument into the dream, the metaphor, the half-remembered image that surfaces in a person's mind while they are looking at a mountain and cannot quite explain why they feel, standing there, that the ground beneath them is watching them back. The Gigantomachy ended as a battle, but as a story, as a living, working, culturally productive story. It was only just beginning, and what it produced, across the centuries and across civilizations, is one of the most remarkable cultural trails in all of human history. A thread that runs from the pottery workshops of archaic Greece through the great philosophical academies of Athens, through the sculptural programs of Hellenistic kings, through Rome, through the Renaissance, through the volcanic science of the modern world, and arrives, still recognizable, still carrying its original charge, in the present day. Let us follow that thread slowly, the way it deserves to be followed. The earliest visual representations of the Gigantomachy appear on Greek pottery, and they appear early. By the 7th century BCE, artists were already working with this material. Black figure vases, their surfaces divided into registers of narrative action, show the giants in combat with the Olympians in images of striking compositional energy. The giants are shown as warriors, heavily armed, often bearded, carrying shields and spears. Not yet the serpent-legged, mountainous creatures they would become in later tradition, but recognizably different from the gods who oppose them, larger somehow, rougher at the edges, carrying a visual weight that the gods, with their composed, idealized proportions, do not. What is remarkable about these early images is how seriously they take the combat. This is not triumphalist art, showing a foregone conclusion. The figures strain against each other with equal energy. The outcome, compositionally, is not obvious. The artist is not showing you a victory parade. The artist is showing you a fight, a genuine, dangerous, unresolved fight, and asking you to feel the uncertainty of it even as you already know how it ends. This is very good storytelling, and it is very honest storytelling. By the 5th century BCE, the Gigantomachy had become one of the canonical subjects of monumental Greek art, placed alongside the Amazonomachy and the Centauromachy as what scholars call the three great Machii, the battles that defined the Athenian cultural imagination. These three conflicts were understood as parallel expressions of the same fundamental idea: the victory of order over chaos, of civilization over the forces that would unmake it. The Parthenon, that extraordinary building that still stands, in its ruined magnificence, on the Acropolis of Athens, carried the Gigantomachy on the interior of its shield of Athena Parthenos, the great gold and ivory cult statue that stood within it, 40 feet tall, clad in gold, holding a small figure of Nike in one outstretched hand. Athena carried the war against the giants on her own body as a permanent declaration of what she stood for and what she had overcome. The metopes of the Parthenon, the carved panels that ran around the exterior of the building, depicted the three great Machii on different sides of the structure: the giants, the Amazons, the centaurs, and the fall of Troy, four conflicts, four expressions of the same civilizational argument. We are Athens. We have faced the forces that would end us. We have prevailed, and we have carved that prevailing into stone so that it cannot be forgotten. There is a political dimension to this that should not be ignored. The Gigantomachy was not a politically neutral subject in classical Athens. The Athenians had, within living memory of the Parthenon's construction, faced the Persian invasions, an existential threat to Greek civilization that had included the burning of Athens itself, including the earlier temples on the Acropolis. The rebuilding of the Acropolis under Pericles and the placement of the Gigantomachy within its most important structures was a statement. The Persians were not named. They did not need to be. The giants were sufficient. The old story carried the new meaning without straining. Mythology used this way is not escapism. It is the most economical form of political speech imaginable. One image, carrying thousands of years of accumulated meaning, saying in stone what would require volumes to say in prose. Then comes Pergamon, and Pergamon is where the Gigantomachy achieves what many consider its supreme visual expression. An artwork so extraordinary that even its fragments, scattered now across museums in Berlin and Istanbul and elsewhere, retain a power that is genuinely difficult to stand in front of calmly. The great altar of Pergamon, constructed in the 2nd century BCE under the Attalid kings of that prosperous, culturally ambitious Hellenistic city-state, featured a frieze running around its entire base, approximately 400 feet of carved marble, depicting the Gigantomachy in a style of such intense, almost unbearable emotional expressiveness, that it represents a fundamental break from the classical Greek ideal of composed beauty. These giants suffer, visibly, specifically, individually suffer. Their faces contort, their bodies twist in directions that convey pain with an anatomical precision that suggests the sculptors had studied how bodies move when they are being destroyed. The serpent legs coil and strain. The expressions are not the noble, accepting expressions of classical Greek defeat. They are raw, anguished, fully present in their agony. You look at the face of a dying giant on the Pergamon frieze and you feel, despite yourself, something. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The recognition of what a great force looks like when it is failing, when something enormous is losing, when the ancient world's version of gravity is, finally, pulling something down that had, for a long time, seemed too large and too fundamental to fall. This is the Gigantomachy at its most honest, not a celebration of divine victory, so much as an unflinching examination of what victory costs, on both sides, and what it looks like when the old order, for all its elemental fury, is finally extinguished. The Pergamon altar is now housed primarily in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, where the reconstructed frieze rises around you in a scale that approximates the original's intention. To stand inside that reconstruction is to understand, viscerally and immediately, that the ancient world was not dealing in abstractions when it told this story. It was dealing in something it felt in its bones. Beyond the visual arts, the Gigantomachy worked its way deeply into ancient philosophy as a metaphor and a problem. Plato, in the Sophist, uses the conflict between the giants and the gods as a framework for the war between materialism and idealism. The philosophical argument about whether reality is fundamentally physical or fundamentally abstract. The giants, in his telling, are those who insist that only what can be touched, grasped, measured, and weighed is real. The gods stand for the position that the truest realities are forms, ideas, structures that exist beyond the physical world. The Gigantomachy, in this reading, becomes a permanent metaphor for one of the oldest and most persistent arguments in human thought. That reappropriation is remarkable. Plato takes a mythological war and turns it into a diagram of philosophical disagreement. And the fit is so good, so natural, that it does not feel forced, because the giants were always, at some level, about this, about what is primary, about whether the earth beneath us or the sky above us represents the deeper truth of things, about whether the oldest and most fundamental forces are ultimately compatible with order, or whether they are, by their nature, its permanent adversary. The Stoics read the story differently, as an allegory of passion overwhelming reason, of the lower, appetitive nature of existence asserting itself against the rational divine principle that should govern it. For them, the Gigantomachy was an internal drama as much as an external one. The war that Zeus wins against the giants is the war that the rational mind must win every day against the enormous and undisciplined forces that move through it. Rome received the story from Greece and made it its own, as Rome invariably did. Ovid, in the Metamorphoses, gives the giants a compressed but vivid treatment. They are, in his telling, the direct cause of the gods descending to earth in animal forms, fleeing the battle in a chaos that has its own dark comedy to it. Even in the midst of cosmic war, Ovid finds the human angle, the moment of undignified scrambling, the gap between divine pretension and divine behavior under genuine pressure. Virgil uses the giants differently, as a background radiation of threat and memory, a reminder built into the Latin landscape itself that the ground of Italy had once shaken with something older and more dangerous than any human war. The volcanic landscape of the Phlegraean fields near Naples, a genuinely extraordinary region of active fumaroles, sulfurous craters, and land that rises and falls with geological breathing, was understood by the Romans as the actual site of the Gigantomachy. They walked above it, they built above it, they felt the heat rising through the ground, and they knew, at least in the mythological register, exactly what they were walking over. And they built there anyway, which is perhaps the most Roman thing imaginable. What the Gigantomachy left behind, then, is not simply a collection of images and texts. It left behind a way of thinking about the relationship between order and the forces that resist it, a way of understanding the physical world, its eruptions, its earthquakes, its deep geological restlessness, as something that carries memory and intention and grief, a way of understanding victory as incomplete, as always shadowed by the knowledge that what was defeated was not destroyed, and that the earth has a patience which outlasts all the structures built upon it. It left behind, in short, a question, one that the ancient world asked clearly, and that every civilization since has asked again, in its own language, with its own imagery, facing its own version of the giants. The question of what to do with the forces you cannot fully defeat, only bury, only press down, only seal beneath the mountain and hope the mountain holds, and listen, on quiet mornings, to what rises through the ground. Here is something worth sitting with quietly before we begin this final chapter. Every culture, on every continent, in every era of recorded human history, has dreamed of giants, not similar giants, not variations on a theme borrowed from a neighboring tradition. Independent giants, beings of enormous stature and primordial power, arising separately from the imaginations of people who had never heard of Greece, never heard of Gaia, never heard of the Gigantomachy. The Norse had their Jotnar, the frost giants and fire giants who preceded the gods and would ultimately outlast them at Ragnarok, swallowing the world in the end rather than being defeated by it. The ancient Mesopotamians had Humbaba, the enormous guardian of the cedar forest, a being of elemental power whose face was made of entrails and whose voice was the sound of flood. The Hebrews had the Nephilim, those fallen, enormous, ambiguous figures who appear in Genesis almost without explanation, children of divine beings and mortal women, walking the earth before the flood came and simplified things. The Norse Ymir, the primordial frost giant, was so vast that the world itself was made from his body after he was slain, his bones becoming the mountains, his blood the seas, his skull the sky. Creation, in that tradition, is quite literally a giant. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, and it is too widespread to be cultural borrowing. It is something else, something that lives in the structure of human imagination itself, a recurring dream, arising independently wherever human beings have found themselves small beneath a large sky, standing on ground that occasionally and terrifyingly moves, looking up at mountains and volcanoes and feeling, with the deepest animal part of themselves, that something vast is present in the world that is neither human nor simply weather. Giants are how we have always named that feeling. The Norse tradition deserves particular attention here, because it engages with the question of giants in a way that is, if anything, even more unresolved than the Greek. The Jotnar, often translated as giants, though the word carries more complexity than that translation suggests, were not simply enemies of the Norse gods. They were their relatives, their ancestors. In some tellings, the gods of Asgard were themselves descended from the primordial giant Ymir, and they continued, uncomfortably, to intermarry with the Jotnar throughout the mythological cycle. Thor, the great giant slayer, had a giant mother. Odin sought wisdom from giants repeatedly, recognized that they possessed knowledge the gods did not. The boundary between god and giant in Norse mythology is porous, contested, and never entirely settled, which gives the whole tradition a psychological depth and ambiguity that the Greek version, for all its sophistication, approaches less directly. And crucially, in Norse mythology, the giants win in the end. At Ragnarok, the fire giant Surtur burns the world. The frost giants pour through the broken boundaries of Asgard. The gods fall one by one to opponents they have faced before in smaller conflicts and will now face in the final consuming version. The world ends. The old earth and the old sky are destroyed together. And then, quietly, without fanfare, in the final verses of the Voluspa, the world is reborn, green and new and washed clean, rising from the water, beginning again. The giants, in this telling, are not the enemies of creation. They are the agents of the renewal that can only come after total destruction. They are the necessary ending that makes the new beginning possible. That is a profoundly different theology than the Greek one, and it is worth carrying both of them in mind simultaneously. The Greek story, where the old earth is defeated and order prevails, and the Norse story, where the old earth wins and the world must begin again from nothing. Between those two visions, much of human thought about power, time, and the fate of civilizations finds its home. What does all of this tell us, finally, about ourselves? The giants, across every tradition that has ever dreamed of them, represent something consistent beneath their surface variation. They represent the world before the rules were written, the power that preceded the current order, the forces that were here before us and that, in some sense, will be here after us. The volcanic, the seismic, the oceanic, the atmospheric, the world in its raw, unmanaged, pre-civilizational enormity. We build our structures above that world, our temples, our philosophies, our orderly arrangements of power and meaning and governance. And we tell stories about how the enormous was defeated, or buried, or sealed beneath a mountain. We tell those stories, I think, not because we fully believe them, but because we need to rehearse them, because the alternative, the acknowledgement that the enormous was only ever managed and never truly ended, is too large to hold in the mind without a story around it to give it shape. The Greeks were honest enough to admit, within the story itself, that Enceladus still breathes beneath Etna, that the giants are not gone, that Gaia has not forgotten. They built their temples anyway. They carved their friezes. They told their children the story of how order prevailed. And the mountain, in the south of Sicily, continued to burn. It burns still, and somewhere in that burning, if you listen for it, past the geological explanation, past the vocabulary of magma and tectonic pressure and crustal movement, there is something older than all of those words, pressing upward from the earth with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry, something that remembers when the sky was new, and has not yet finished with it.